Hello, my name is Dennis Swindle. I'm the minister with the Milan Church of Christ in Milan, Michigan, and I want to thank you for joining me in the second lesson in a series of Bible classes about an Old Testament story that I call David's Plague. King David, actually. David's Plague. And the main reading for this will come from the book of First Chronicles. First Chronicles chapter 21. So if you have a Bible available, please turn it to First Chronicles 21. The parallel reading, which contains the same story, is found in 2 Samuel, the 24th chapter, to which I will occasionally refer. Now, in our first study, I defined the word plague as I intend for it to be used in this particular study. So let me repeat that. A plague is a widespread or pervasive illness, affliction, or calamity that may be regarded as a punishment or warning from God. And King David's plague was just that. Now, in my first study, we just barely scratched 1 Chronicles 21, but we'll go farther today. Now, before we continue, let me just give you some background. King David was ruling Israel and Judah at the time, and he was actually approaching his final years of rule. Unfortunately, Israel was unfaithful to God, and thus he was compelled to intervene in order to wake up the nation, get them to repent, and they could then be preserved for many subsequent generations. The reason this was important is because God knew that his son, the Messiah, would eventually come from Israel hundreds of years hence. And one other thing, as we proceed, we will occasionally encounter some apparent discrepancies between 1 Chronicles 21 and 2 Samuel 24, but as we noted in our first study, those discrepancies are not difficult to explain. All right, 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1. Now, Satan stood against Israel and moved David to number Israel, that is, to take a census of the Israelites. And according to 2 Samuel 24, God was behind this, and he permitted Satan to tempt David, and again, for good reason. Israel needed this wake-up call, and the consequences that would be brought on by the numbering of the people would indeed serve to wake up many in Israel. And I focused or emphasized in my first study that this should remind us that God is in control, not the devil. Job said, "No purpose of yours, of God's, can be withheld." Job 42, verse 2. And even a relatively wicked king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar, after God had humbled him and woke him up, said in Daniel 4:35, "He, Jehovah God, does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth." So even when the devil seems to be running amok and wreaking havoc on planet Earth, just remember, God is in ultimate control. All right, let's go to verse 2. So David said to Joab was his commander-in-chief of his armies, "Go, number Israel from Beersheba to Dan, and bring the number of them to me, that I may know it." In other words, this is for me. This is something I want to know. And Joab answered, "May the Lord make his people," and Israel were God's people. They didn't belong to David. They belonged to God. And Joab is reminding David of this. "May the Lord make his people 100 times more than they are. But my lord the king, are they not all my Lord's servants?" David, they're serving you. They're serving you. Why then does my Lord require this thing? Why should he be a cause of guilt in Israel? Now, what did Joab mean? He was well aware that numbering the people without God's express permission or command was a sin, a horrible sin. You see, long before this, God had previously issued orders for the people to be numbered. You read about it in Exodus 30, verse 11, Numbers chapter 1 and verse 2. In fact, the book of Numbers comes from the fact that God commanded a numbering, a census, as it were, of his people. And God had reasons for that. But not here. Not on this occasion. No, this is different. And you know, it's not hard to figure out why numbering the nation was not a good thing, especially for a king who just decides, hey, I want to do this thing. Pride. Pride was the problem. And it would be a problem for King David. Are you aware that there are at least 4 reasons why pride is so destructive, so harmful? First and foremost, it places our attention on ourselves instead of God. That's never good. Secondly, it credits self, not God. Thirdly, as a direct result, it elevates self and demotes God. And fourthly, it makes one dependent upon self and not God. Pride has led mankind downhill from the beginning. Think just for a moment about Eve in the garden when tempted by the devil. What was the straw that broke, as we say, the camel's back in her case? I'm reading from Genesis 3, verse 6. I think it's clear. So when the woman saw that the tree with the forbidden fruit, that God had said, do not touch it, nor eat of it, when she saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate it. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. When she saw that it would make one wise. Wise like whom? God. And that was a big part of the temptation. Read verse 5 when the devil said, you know what? Your eyes will be opened and you will be like God. How nice would that be? And that was that proverbial straw. Proverbs 16 verse 18 says, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Even in the garden. And it has led to the fall of countless people throughout time and still leads to the fall of people today. Let me just give you one other example. Do you recall the reason that Moses and Aaron were not allowed to enter the promised land? I mean, from the time that they brought the Israelites out of Egyptian captivity and bondage and into the wilderness and ultimately toward the promised land, that's the one place that Moses wanted to set foot, and his brother Aaron as well. And yet God said no. Listen as I read from the book of Numbers, the 20th chapter, beginning with verse 7. Now you're free to turn there if you want to, but at least listen carefully as I read that account to remind us of why Moses and Aaron were not allowed to enter the promised land. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together, speak to the rock. Speak to the rock, because God had on previous occasions brought water miraculously from a rock. Normally, God commanded Moses to strike a rock with a staff, but not on this occasion. God says, speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. And you shall bring water for them out of the rock to give to the congregation and their animals. So Moses, and notice he does much of what God commands, but in the end he deviates. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him, so he obeys. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, as God commanded. And he said to them, and now Moses begins to deviate. Hear now, you rebels, must not God, must we bring water for you out of this rock? Verse 11, then Moses lifted not his voice, he lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. I've often wondered, Moses is thinking, I can do this thing. I'm going to strike that rock and water's going to come out, and he strikes it. Nothing happens. I have a feeling Moses gets a little nervous and thinks, uh-oh, it's not working. So he strikes it again. Well, this time, by the grace and mercy of God, water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. But oh, was God upset. Listen to verse 12. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron. And listen to what he says. Because you did not believe me to hallow me. Hallow means to honor, to glorify, to lift up. To hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel. Therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. You'll fall short because of what you did. I have asked myself, and I've heard others ask the same question. Why would God prevent Moses, of all people, and his brother Aaron, from entering the promised land, the one place they most wanted to be, for a seeming minor offense? I mean, just this one time, they don't quite do it God's way. They did part of what God said, didn't they? Yes. And they just this one little deviation. Because of what was behind the deviation. What was behind the disobedience. That was not minor. It was pride. And how do we know? Because of what God says. You did not believe me to hallow me, to glorify me, to honor me in the eyes of the children of Israel. You see, Moses and Aaron desired to hallow, to glorify, to honor someone else. And who was it? Them, me, Moses, Aaron. And to give someone else. Must we bring water out of this rock? For some reason, they decided it's time to give us a little honor here. Time to give us our due, the respect we deserve. Let's go back now to 1 Chronicles 21. And it's not hard to see how pride would be ruinous to King David. I mean, think about it. He commands the numbering. It takes place. And when he hears these vast numbers, especially in his army, what does he think? Wow, what a colossal army. What a formidable army. I control. I rule. And when you think that, pretty soon, what are you thinking? Wow, look at me. Look at how powerful I, King David, am. In fact, this is really all my doing. I'm the one that brought the nation back together. I'm the one that the people adore. I'm the one that the people virtually worship. I'm the one in charge here. I'm responsible for all of this. And if somebody dared to say, but King David, what about God? I think he would have said, oh, hey, yes, I believe in God all the way. But you know what? He doesn't have a lot to do with this army. It's me. It's my doing. It shouldn't come as any surprise that the Bible repeatedly, unremittingly condemns this thing we call pride. It has brought so many down. Not just Eve, not just Moses, not just King David. It brings people down today. Sometimes I fear for our president. And he has done some good things. He has fulfilled many of his campaign promises, maybe more than any president in recent memory. But sometimes the way he talks, it's almost like it's all him. Proverbs 6:17 talks about things that God hates, sinful things, but one of them, he says, is a proud look. You ever seen someone have that look? I've seen people with that look. It's almost like they look at you, as we say, down their nose at you, like, who are you? Who are you? Are you even worthy to come into my presence, to be close to me, that I should even talk to you? Have you ever felt that way? You'd say, oh, I've never felt that way. Tell me something. Have you ever walked somewhere, maybe downtown in a large city, and seen people begging, or not even begging, people literally lying in the gutter in a drunken stupor, or perhaps freezing, and just thought, well, I'm glad that's not me. Pride. Proverbs 11, verse 2, when pride comes, then comes shame. Proverbs 29:23, a man's pride will bring him low, not up where he thinks it's taking him. Jesus talked about pride because there were times his apostles and disciples were full of it. And Jesus just could not stand that. In Matthew 23 and verse 12 and Luke 14:11, Jesus said, whoever exalts himself will be humbled. James 4 verse 6, God opposes the proud. Peter says God resists the proud. 1 Peter 5 and verse 5. Okay, we got to move on. We're almost done with part 2 here, but before we do that, let me just add one additional observation about Joab, about his pleading with David. Don't do this thing. Don't go through this thing. I believe it was God's Holy Spirit that was working there, that was behind Joab pleading with the king to change his mind. Even though God had a motive for allowing Satan to tempt David, God still hates sin. He always has. Again, read Proverbs 6:16 through 19. God hates sin. And God hates it when his people commit sin. It hurts him. And when he sees his people, including you and me, heading towards sin, frequently he'll place some barrier, some obstacle, some obstruction in our way. Has that ever happened to you? Where you've been going toward some sinful act, activity, or practice, or even thought, and just something suddenly happened, the phone rang, or the doorbell, or knock, or whatever, and just something unexpected, and you wonder, where did that come from? Folks, that's happened to me scores of times. I can recall a time, I would not mention it, it'd be way too embarrassing. God knows of it, where I was making one bad decision after another, and it seemed like every day something was trying to get in my way. God was trying to slow me down, trying to turn me around, and guess what? Like King David of old, I didn't listen. I was so determined to do what was wrong. Well, that's what God was trying to do for King David, to slow him down. When Joab strenuously protested, 1 Corinthians 10:13 tells us two things. God will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we're able to withstand, but also that God will make a way of escape. And sometimes when you are going in the wrong way, God will put those obstacles in your way. So if nothing else, you'll at least stop, pause, and look for the way of escape instead of continuing down that road that ultimately will take you to hell unless you change, unless you repent, unless you come back to your first love. All right, 1 Chronicles 21, verse 4. Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed over Joab. Satan, trying to move too fast. King David would not listen. In fact, 2 Samuel 24 and verse 4 tells us that the king's word prevailed not only against Joab, but against his captains. So apparently the captains that Joab would need to assist him with the census also went to King David and said, don't do this thing. And David wouldn't listen to anybody. His mind was made up. We continue in verse 4. Therefore, David, that's what I get when I read too fast. Forgive me. Therefore, Joab departed, and he's not happy. Oh, he's so unhappy. This is one assignment he would give anything if somebody else could carry it out. But no, he's the commander. And when his commander-in-chief gives him the order, he feels compelled. Okay, so he went throughout all Israel and came to Jerusalem. It takes about 9 months, 20 days, according to 2 Samuel 24, verse 8, for him to complete the task along with all those who assisted him. So he came to Jerusalem, and he's not happy. It says, then Joab gave the sum of the number of the people to David. All Israel had 1,100,000 men who drew the sword. That was the big part of the census for David. I want to know how mighty my army is, how many serve me in it. And Judah had 470,000 men who drew the sword. Let me just comment quickly that the numbers are slightly different in 2 Samuel 24 than in 1 Chronicles 21. 2 Samuel records that 800,000 valiant men drew the sword. But in that reading, it was simply discounting the standing army, the active army, whose numbers David was already aware. All right? And that standing army was about 300,000, which added 800,000 would come up to the 1,100,000. Also in 2 Samuel 24, it says the men of Judah, the fighting men of Judah, were 500,000 as opposed to the 470,000 recorded in 1 Chronicles 21. But in this case, 1 Chronicles omits Judah's standing army, which would be 30,000. So you still get the total of 500,000. Okay, verse 6, 1 Chronicles 21. But he, speaking of Joab, did not count Levi and Benjamin among them, for the king's word was abominable to Joab. He hated what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. He was under order, and he just got to the point that said, I'm stopping right here. Enough is enough. This sin has gone far enough. Oh, that this world would come to that decision, that our country would come to that decision. Well, I have a little more to say about that in just a moment. And God was displeased with this thing, the census, the unauthorized numbering of the people. Therefore, he struck Israel. Time had come. God's punishment was at hand. And God's punishment may have commenced that very day. I have to pause right here. God willing, I'll pick up in our next study with verse 8. But I want to conclude with a very important thought that I'm going to come back to several times in this study. Again, according to 2 Samuel 24, God had good reason for permitting Satan to tempt David. Israel was going in the wrong direction. They needed a warning or a wake-up call because God knew if they didn't have that, they might be wiped out long before Jesus could come on the scene and live and suffer and die and bleed to pay the price for the sins of mankind. So God had to wake them up. Listen, does our world need that wake-up call? our nation, our state? You and I as Christians, do we need a wake-up call? Could it be that the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus is a wake-up call to a world that is increasingly converting to religions that deny the deity of Jesus Christ, that deny the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that deny that Jesus is anything except a prophet who did novel miracles? Could this virus be a wake-up call to a nation, our nation, the United States of America, that's growing increasingly anti-God, anti-Christ, anti-Bible, anti-moral? Could it be a wake-up call to we as Christians that are growing contented, comfortable, complacent, lukewarm? Think about it. Pray about it. And if anything is amiss in your life, do something about it. Do something about it. Thank you for watching this video, and please join me again for lesson 3 on David's plague. May God help us, bless us all, and God bless you.